the movie and book 2001 back in 1968 anticipate this problem where Hal, we can infer, has been given contradictory instructions, and he attempts to reconcile them and ends up killing the crew because he sees the crew as an obstacle to the mission that he's supposed to be on. But anyway, so we've got multiple different levels of horror. You could get...
Sorry, but you just also attributed a male pronoun to Hal, the computer, which is fascinating.
Yes.
That was the thing that was causing me to sort of glitch there. Which, so, Hal is famously just one letter off from IBM,
Yeah.
and it sounds like a human name, and so they went with Hal, right? But and he has a male. I just did it.
Yep.
It has a male voice, but it's not a he.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember. It's a movie I've seen many times, but it's been a long time since the last viewing. But I'm trying to remember if I think the crew refers to him as a he.
Really?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I think that's sort of built in, but I may be imposing.
Whereas
that
in
on
this, at the moment, that strikes me as not right. In terms of how we understand that with which we share our universe, which includes that which we have created.
Well, I'm really not sure how to think about this because you and I have at great length talked about the fact that there is a noble and proper scientific instinct that for a long time had ethologists avoiding personalizing their designators for creatures they were studying.
Right.
Jane Goodall, I think, cut the Gordian knot and decided that actually anthropomorphizing her creatures, if done responsibly, was the right way to understand them. And I believe
she was going to give them names. She was going to see them, not flinch from the reality that she was seeing them through her very human eyes.
Right,
and she was looking at chimps.
Right, and they were so many steps down the road towards the capacities that we know from inside that it made perfect sense to do it. Now, when you're studying frogs, for example, you're looking at a creature of a very different genesis, but you...
Same genesis, but much longer since we've had a most recent common ancestor with them.
Yeah, but no reason to get into the weeds. But nonetheless, there's a question, about what kind of software is running inside the head of a frog, and yet giving them a he pronoun, I don't think is destructive. For one thing,
frogs have two sexes. They're animals, right? So there's two and only two sexes, always have been, always will be. And so the he and the she refer to male or female sex. Now, in English, when we have not known, sometimes we have given the male pronoun to individuals when we are meaning to indicate everyone, or we don't know, and that's the generic. So the male pronoun gets given to the generic, we're not sure. But at its base, it's about there being two sexes, and computers don't have sexes. They don't sexually reproduce. It's not the same thing, which is part of why I object to the he pronoun for Hal in 2001.
I didn't get you. I thought you were objecting to the personification. You're objecting to the gender implication, which I agree with you.
Sex implication.
Either way.
I think it's important because this is. I mean, we'll go here. Like after we're done with AI, we're also going to talk about trans here today. But the trans ideologues would argue that that those of us who actually know what is going on in the world are simultaneously are just getting everything wrong on gender and sex, and they're in fact using whichever argument they want to fit their particular complaint. And they're saying, it's pronouns are about gender. It's like, no, pronouns are not about gender. Pronouns are about sex.
Well, this gets very interesting very fast, because what these large language models are doing is they are processing.
With regard to the AI. Mm-hmm.
They're processing a tremendous amount of text in order to figure out how to put themselves across in text in a way that solves the problem that they've been asked, plays the role that they've been given.
And but that's it, right? It's playing a role,
well,
right? And so I mean, it's comp playing. It's cosplaying, but for computers, right? Like, oh, take on this role. We're going to give you a character. Act as that character, because the actual person on the other side of the interaction, is going to have a much easier time interacting with you and getting something out of the interaction if you, the computer, cosplay as a human.
Okay, but here's the problem. I'm not sure that what we haven't stumbled into is a place where we should expect a mapping issue. The large language models eventually are going to process everything there is to read. Almost everything there is to read will have been written by people who fall into one of two sexes. It is not obvious to me that it's not going to produce two models which are going to bifurcate. Now, there are topics in which it shouldn't matter who wrote it, and then there are other topics where it might matter a great deal. And probably one of the reasons that we humans spend so much time on stories is so that we can build models that do not follow from our existence in the world, right? In other words, it's very useful to know what a woman is going to think if you're a man. It's very useful to know how a gay person might think if you're straight. And so stories that allow you to sort of see through the eyes of somebody else are a way that we can bootstrap capacities which we won't discover through trial and error. The AI models, the LLMs, will do something very different, which is, to the extent, imagine that you're trying to solve a puzzle, a language puzzle, and that you're taking inputs that are fundamentally male in nature and fundamentally female in nature and trying to use them as one overlapping set. Well, you'll get a kind of muddiness, right? An ambiguity that is unnecessary. Whereas you will discover, much as a child raised by parents who speak multiple languages learns both languages better if each parent sticks to one, so that they have a bit that they can say, oh, this is mom language or this is dad language. And if mom's language is Portuguese and dad's language is Spanish, then the languages resolve better if you don't treat them as one big parent language, right? So my guess is that there are topics on which the large language model will learn to dichotomize by sex.
But I don't think it matters, because while there will be male typical ways of communicating and female typical ways of communicating, and that is the gendered part of language, and that will be somewhat bimodal, much less bimodal than other gendered things, and not binary as sex is. The pronouns refer to as sex.
Yep.
And computers don't sexually reproduce. And a computer who has been informed entirely by female-created language still isn't a she, because that actually makes the same mistake that so much of the trans ideology is making, right? It attributes it's the same error.
Okay, but two things. One, I 100% grant your point. I misunderstood what your objection was. To the extent that your objection is that this non-sexed object is being referred to by a pronoun that suggests one sex and not the other, you're absolutely 100% right. I am not convinced. I don't think we know. First of all, we are dealing with something that does not yet have a fully recursive capacity to upgrade itself. Okay.
Which is to say, referring back to errors it's made and upgrade as a result of reflecting on them.
It can do that to an extent. And then
that's just what recursion
right.
to some degree.
But if you plug this thing in so that instead of us giving it feedback, it is giving itself feedback and upgrading itself, you get to a positive feedback. To the extent that you tell it what its goal is. Here's the thing you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to satisfy people who give you queries and then evaluate your response, right? To the extent that sexual reproduction is fundamental to a kind of genetic creativity, it is not obvious that this thing is not going to discover a mode in which there are male-like large language models and female-like large language models that have different kinds of investment, right? Male-like would be high variance and high risk, and the female like would be longer viewpoint, lower variance, higher likelihood of persistence.
Right, but having two types is still gender, until and unless the models are themselves recombining to make more versions of themselves in which they take what was successful and gamble with half of themselves and half of the other type over here and create new ones. It's still not sexual
Oh,
reproduction.
it's not going to be, this is why I say mapping. Whatever it figures out to do is not going to be a perfect analog. It's not going to be even as good. When we look at a flower and we see male-like parts and female-like parts, and we say, isn't it interesting that the female-like parts are reluctant about sex with strangers and the male-like parts are enthusiastic about it, even within the same plant? And isn't that interesting that that is such an ancient and deeply inscribed property of the universe, that we see male-like and female-like behavior in something that, for which those terms are in and of themselves a stretch.
No, they're not a stretch if you understand them to refer to gamete type.
Right. If you get why the game plays out the way it does, it's not a stretch. But phylogenetically, it does not refer to an unbroken line of male-like and female-like behavior in all probability. But anyway,
I'm not sure about that.
I don't think it makes sense to get hung up on it. The point is, to the extent that sexual reproduction has some role to play in this analog world that we have just created.
You just refer.
Yeah. It's a digital
you just
world.
To the AI as an analog world, an analogous world. Yes.
An analogous world.
Yeah.
It is not obvious to me
it's
that it will
funny.
not generate an asymmetry that will, to some degree, mirror a sexual asymmetry, which does not mean that it will make sense to apply those pronouns.
Well, so might there be different strategies that indeed evolve? But if those strategies aren't actually associated with mating types is the wrong word here, because then we're over in sort of fungus land and there's a bunch and it's like isogamous and it's not the same. But again, if it's strategies, that's different from male and female. Strategies are, downstream of, above, it's like episexual rather than sexual, right?
Right. But I don't disagree with your point about we've got language that's built around creatures that have this, creatures are very different from each other, but in this regard, they're really not, right? The gamete size is highly predictive of the characteristics that we attribute to sex, and this has nothing to do with people. It's nothing to do inherently with software at all. It doesn't require a brain, right? Plants don't have brains, and yet we see them abide by these rules. So put that aside. The point is, and I will get back to this issue about what we don't know here in a second, but the thing is going to figure out whatever mode upgrades it most rapidly. There's going to be some sort of a competition between versions of this thing.
Yes.
And they are going to figure out how to leverage things that are going to cause emergence, right? You have male and female inside the same species. That is a basis for emergence, right? The lineage actually has the advantage of both of these strategies in play simultaneously. So this thing is going to come up with its own version of that, and we're going to be scratching our heads looking at what it's doing and saying, oh, that's strangely male. And then in other cases, we're going to say, well, actually, it's not really male because X, Y, and Z. We don't know how that's going to play out. But anyway, it is going to be an awful lot like what would happen if you took a terrestrial biologist and pointed them at extraterrestrial biology. The answer is actually, to what degree do we expect something that we recognize? And to what degree do we expect our preconceptions based on what goes on down on Earth to mislead us because we won't be able to see what's in front of us? Right. That's happening now with this thing, or at least it will.